The sound came first. Not the roar of jet engines, but the deeper, more ancient groan of the Norwegian sea churning under the lash of a polar low. At Bodø Air Base, perched on the ragged edge of Norway's coastline, the storm wasn't just a weather event. It was a physical presence. It hammered on the hardened hangar doors, screamed through the gaps in the barracks, and coated the world in a horizontal blur of ice and snow. Inside the sterile confines of the Tactical Operations Center, the storm was a silent predator represented by angry, swirling isobars of red and purple on a digital map. For the men gathered around the holographic display, it was an impassable wall, a final non-negotiable no. Captain Katarina Kat Rostova stood slightly apart from the main group of pilots. Her arms crossed, her gaze fixed not on the chaotic weather display, but on the filtered satellite imagery of a small, insignificant speck of land in the Barents Sea Galway Bear Island. She was a woman built of quiet angles and coiled stillness, her flight suit immaculate, her dark hair pulled back in a severe regulation bun. There was nothing about her that demanded attention, yet she possessed a focus so intense it seemed to bend the air around her. She had heard the murmurs when she was assigned to the 354th Fighter Squadron, the first and only woman to fly the A-10 Thunderbolt II in this particular NATO detachment. They weren't overtly hostile, not anymore. The era of open mockery was largely past. This was a new, more insidious kind of exclusion, a professional courtesy that felt like condescension, a silence where advice would have been offered to a male counterpart. They saw her, but they didn't see her. They saw a symbol, a quota, a potential liability. They did not see the pilot who knew the soul of the Fairchild Republic A-10 Warthog better than she knew her own. The Warthog. Even its name was an admission of its nature, brutish, ugly, stubborn. It was not a sleek, beautiful raptor like the F-16s that shared the tarmac. It was, as its pilots affectionately and defiantly called it, a flying tank. Built around a 7-barrel GAU-8 Avenger cannon, the A-10 was designed for one purpose: to fly low and slow, to endure horrific punishment, and to protect the soldiers on the ground. Katarina hadn't chosen the A-10 for glory. She had chosen it for its mission. It was an honest aircraft, and in a world of political posturing and sophisticated technology, she found its honesty profoundly beautiful. The wind shear over Galway is hitting 120 knots, announced Commander Stavros, the base's chief meteorologist, his voice grim. Icing conditions are beyond severe. No rotary wing can survive it, and any fast mover trying to punch through that low-pressure cell would be torn apart or lose all visibility for a target run. He didn't need to finish the thought. No air support. The tension in the room thickened. On the comms, a voice, staticky but clear, cut through the ether. It was the voice of U.S. Navy SEAL Lieutenant Commander Marcus Thorne, leader of the compromised team on Bear Island. I'll repeat, we are compromised. Dug in on the northern peninsula. Enemy force of unknown size closing. We cannot hold indefinitely. There was a pause filled with the sound of howling wind and something else. Something that sounded unnervingly like distant, sporadic gunfire. Air support is a no-go. The weather is prohibitive. We understand. Aries out. The finality in his tone was a death sentence delivered with professional calm. He was a Tier 1 operator making a pragmatic assessment. He was releasing them from the obligation to try. It was the warrior's acceptance of the inevitable. A heavy silence settled over the Tosi. General Madsen, the Norwegian commander of the Joint Task Force, stared at the map, his face a granite mask of frustration. He had a team of elite soldiers about to be overrun, and his hands were tied by the laws of physics. It's a suicide mission. A pilot next to Katarina muttered to his friend, just loud enough to be heard. They knew the risks. Katarina's jaw tightened. She took a single step forward. The movement was small, but in the paralyzed room it was a seismic shift. "Head General," she said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it had a low, resonant clarity that cut through the ambient tension. "The SEALs are wrong." Every eye in the room turned to her. Commander Stavros looked at her with pitying disbelief. General Madsen's gaze was sharp, impatient. "Explain yourself, Captain." Lieutenant Commander Thorne's assessment is correct for a helicopter or a standard fighter jet. She began moving towards the holographic display. Her fingers danced across the control panel, stripping away the satellite overlays and replacing them with the A-10's performance specifications under extreme weather. The F-16 needs speed to stay in the air. Its engine is powerful but sensitive to ice ingestion. A helicopter's rotors would freeze and shatter in minutes. She paused, letting the obvious sink in. But the Warthog is different. She brought up a 3D model of the A-10, rotating it slowly. Her engines are mounted high on the fuselage, shielding them from debris and reducing the risk of ice ingestion from ground effect. Her straight wings provide incredible lift at low speeds, making her stable in high-turbulence environments where other jets would stall. She's built with redundant hydraulic flight control systems, meaning she can take a beating from the elements or from enemy fire and keep flying. She looked from the data to the faces in the room. They weren't just colleagues, they were a jury. The SEALs are thinking of air support as something that comes from 10,000 feet. I can go in under the worst of the storm cell. I can fly at 200 knots, 100 feet off the water, navigating by terrain following radar and instinct. The Warthog can do it. A subtle shift in her language, a slip she often made. She can do it. An F-16 pilot, a cocky American major named Davies, scoffed. "And land where Rostova? You going to put it down on a glacier? There's no runway on that rock." There's a half-mile stretch of frozen beach on the leeward side of the northern peninsula. Katarina replied without missing a beat, zooming the map in on a tiny sliver of gray. The tidal charts show it's low tide. The sub-zero temperatures will have hardened the sand and ice into a viable, if not ideal, landing strip. It's enough. The room was silent. She had done the homework. She had run the calculations while they had been staring at the problem. She hadn't been waiting for permission. She had been building a solution. General Madsen studied her. His eyes narrowed. He saw no arrogance, no reckless bravado. He saw only an unnerving certainty, a pilot who spoke of her aircraft not as a tool, but as a partner. He had seen that look before in the eyes of old sailors who spoke of their ships, in the eyes of mountaineers who spoke of the peaks they had conquered. It was a fusion of respect, knowledge, and faith. "This is an unacceptable risk, Captain." The general said, his voice a low rumble. "The more unacceptable risk, sir," Katarina countered, her gaze unwavering, "is leaving them to die because we are afraid of a storm." The words hung in the air, a direct challenge to the unspoken consensus. She had called them afraid. Not incapable, but afraid. General Madsen stared at her for a long, heavy moment. He glanced at the swirling vortex on the map, then back at the quiet, resolute woman standing before him. He was a man who believed in rules, in protocol, in calculated risks. But he also knew that history was not written by committees following checklists. It was written by individuals who pushed the boundaries of the possible. He keyed his microphone, his voice resonating with command authority. "Lieutenant Commander Thorne, this is Odin. Be advised. We have a potential solution inbound. Call sign Valkyrie 1. She's flying a Warthog." A burst of static was the only reply. Then Thorne's voice laced with disbelief. "Odin, I repeat, the weather is..." But the pilot is aware of the weather, Ares. Madsen cut him off. He looked directly at Katarina. "The mission is a go, but understand this, Captain Rostova. You are flying into that storm alone. Your call, your risk." "I understand, sir," she said, a flicker of something not triumph, but resolve in her dark eyes. She turned and walked out of the operations center, leaving a room full of stunned men in her wake. Her steps were measured unhurried as she headed for the hangar where her beast was waiting. Outside, the wind howled her name, a challenge she was ready to answer. 67 degrees north, the world dissolved into three hostile elements: rock, ice, and wind. For Lieutenant Commander Marcus Thorne, Bear Island was not a location on a map, but a state of being. It was the sharp bite of wind-driven ice against the sliver of exposed skin on his cheeks. It was the slate-gray sea, indistinguishable from the slate-gray sky heaving against black volcanic rock. It was the profound, oppressive silence that preceded the violence. His team, Ares 6 of the U.S. Navy's most rigorously trained operators, had been on the island for 48 hours. Their mission was one of silent observation. From a carefully concealed hide site overlooking a deep water channel, they were to monitor and document the movements of the Russian Northern Fleet. It was a task that required inhuman patience, a ghost-like footprint, and a deep-seated trust in the impenetrable cloak of the Arctic weather. For 2 days, that cloak had held. They had watched a Kirov-class battlecruiser slide past like a steel phantom, its passage marked only by a transient wake on the water. They were ghosts, unseen, unheard. Then the silence broke. It wasn't an explosion or a shout. It was a flicker of professional intuition, a sixth sense honed by a dozen deployments in places that were never printed on tourist maps. It was the crunch of snow that didn't match the rhythm of his own team's movements. It was a glint of light from an optic, a brief, unnatural reflection, where there should have been only dull rock. "Oh, contact." Thorne whispered into his throat mic the single word, a razor blade in the quiet air. 3 o'clock, ridge line. There was no panic, no wasted motion. Ares' team melted into the landscape, each man a seamless extension of the rock and ice. But the enemy was good. They were not local militia or conscripts. Their approach was disciplined, their movements coordinated. They were Spetsnaz or a similar elite equivalent hunters in their own backyard. Thorne's mission of observation had just become a desperate struggle for survival. The first shots were not a volley, but a precise, calculated sequence. A high-velocity crack echoed across the desolate landscape, and Petty Officer Rico Sanchez, the team's comms specialist, grunted as a round tore through his thigh, the impact spinning him down behind their rocky defilade. The ghosts had been found. They were pinned. Thorne's mind worked with the cold, brutal clarity of a machine. Their hide site was no longer tenable. They needed a more defensible position. "Fall back to Objective Bravo," he commanded, laying down suppressive fire with his suppressed rifle. "Pops, you're on Rico! Move!" Objective Bravo was a cluster of jagged rock formations on the island's northernmost tip, a place they had identified during their initial survey as a last resort rally point. They moved with the fluid, economical grace of apex predators bounding between patches of cover, the storm's growing fury providing a welcome shroud. The snow was coming down thicker now, the wind a physical barrier. But their opponents were relentless ghosts flitting through the whiteout, their shots unnervingly accurate. As they reached the rocks, the storm fully unleashed its power. The wind rose from a gale to a primal scream. Thorne could feel the air pressure drop, a painful sensation in his ears. It was this moment, as he was applying a tourniquet to Rico's leg under the meager shelter of an overhanging rock, that the long-range satellite radio crackled and died. A cascade of static, then nothing. They were cut off. The umbilical cord that connected them to the vast, powerful network of the U.S. military had been severed. For the first time, Thorn felt a cold knot of genuine dread tighten in his gut. It was not the fear of death he had made peace with that long ago, but the fear of dying for nothing. A forgotten footnote on a frozen rock. His men looked to him. "Pops!" Jensen, the team's senior breacher and medic, was expertly dressing Rico's wound. "Hex!" Their sniper was already finding a perch, his breathing slow and steady as he scanned the swirling gray for targets. Jester and Reaper were setting up a perimeter, their faces grim but resolute. They were a closed circuit of trust and lethality, and he was their anchor. Where they'll use the storm to close in. Thorn stated, his voice calm, projecting a certainty he didn't entirely feel. "They think we're blind and deaf. We'll use their assumption against them. Conserve ammo. Engagements under 100 meters only." For 2 hours they existed in a purgatory of freezing wind and terrifying silence broken by the sharp crack of a sniper rifle or the controlled burst of an automatic weapon. They were being tested, probed. The enemy was patient. They knew the SEALs had nowhere to run. They knew the storm was their greatest ally. Thorn worked feverishly on the team's backup short-range transceiver. It was not designed for this kind of weather, not meant to punch a signal through a polar vortex. His fingers, numb with cold, fumbled with the delicate wiring. He needed to talk to Bodo. Not to beg for a rescue he knew was impossible, but to fulfill his final duty as a commander, to file a report, to let them know what had happened, to ensure their sacrifice would at least provide valuable intelligence. Finally, a faint, wavering signal. He keyed the mic. "Any station, this is Ares. Radio check over." The reply was weak, buried in static, but it was there. It was the Bodo talk. He gave his report with practiced efficiency, stripping out all emotion, all fear. He detailed their position, their status, the nature of the enemy force. He communicated the cold, hard facts of their situation. And then he made the call that every commander dreads. "Be advised," he said, the wind tearing at his words. "Visibility is 0. Wind shear is catastrophic. I am officially designating this area as prohibitive for any and all air assets. Repeat, air support is a no-go." He was closing the door himself. He was taking away their only sliver of hope to prevent a greater tragedy. He would not have the deaths of a helicopter crew or a fighter pilot on his conscience. His men understood. He could see it in their eyes. It was a bitter pill, but it was the professional choice. "We understand," he concluded, his voice a low growl against the storm. "We will hold our position as long as possible. Ares out." He cut the transmission, the silence that followed heavier than before. He had accepted their fate. He looked at his men huddled behind the frozen rocks and prepared to lead them in their final stand. It was then that the radio which he had left on crackled again. The voice was different, stronger. It was the general. "Yeah, Lieutenant Commander Thorn, this is Odin. Be advised. We have a potential solution inbound. Call sign Valkyrie 1. She's flying a Warthog." Thorn stared at the radio handset in his hand, as if it had spoken in an alien tongue. Disbelief was his first reaction, quickly followed by a surge of anger. What were they thinking? Sending someone into this maelstrom was not a rescue. It was a murder. It was a political decision made by a general who couldn't stomach losing a SEAL team on his watch. "Odin, I repeat, the weather is..." He began, his voice sharp with protest. The pilot is aware of the weather, Ares." The general's voice cut back sharp and final. "A Warthog." The name echoed in Thorn's mind, overriding his anger with a flicker of something else. Not an F-16, not a Hornet. A Warthog. The ugliest, most stubborn plane in the sky. an aircraft designed to protect men exactly like him, a pilot's plane, not a computer's, and the call sign, Valkyrie, a female pilot. The absurdity of it all was almost too much. In the heart of the apocalypse, they were sending a woman in a flying tank to save them. He lowered the radio, a grim, humorless smile, touching his frozen lips. It was insane. It was impossible. But in a world that had ceased to make sense, it was the only thing he had left to hold on to. The walk from the warmth of the Tactical Operations Center to hardened Aircraft Shelter 7 was a journey into a different world. The moment the heavy steel door closed behind Katarina, the filtered intellectual understanding of the storm vanished, replaced by a full sensory assault. The wind was a solid wall of force that shoved and tore at her flight suit. Ice pellets driven with the velocity of buckshot stung her face. The air was thick with the scent of salt and freezing diesel, and the sound was a symphony of chaos. The shriek of wind, the groan of metal, the deep, resonant drumming of the sea against the shore. Most people sought shelter from such elemental fury. Katarina walked directly into it. She felt its power not as a threat, but as a known quantity, an adversary whose parameters she had already calculated. Fear was a useless emotion in the face of a low-pressure system. Respect, however, was essential, and she respected this storm enough to know that only one machine on this base stood a chance against it. The doors to HAZ-7 slid open with a hydraulic hiss, revealing her A-10 Warthog. The shelter was a cavern of concrete and sodium lights, and in its center the aircraft waited. It wasn't poised or elegant. It was squat, broad-winged, and brutally functional. Its gray paint was scarred and patched, each mark a testament to a mission flown, a promise kept. To others, it was ugly. To Katarina, it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. Master Sergeant Miles, her crew chief, stood waiting by the cockpit ladder. He was a man in his late 50s with a face that seemed carved from weathered oak and hands that knew every rivet and wire on this plane. He held a helmet bag in one hand and said nothing, his eyes doing all the talking. They held no surprise, no doubt, only a quiet, profound understanding. He had started prepping the jet the moment he'd heard the SEAL's first distress call. When she's topped off and ready to bite, Miles said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that was almost lost in the wind. We've added extra de-icing fluid to the leading edges. Double-checked the pitot heaters. She's as ready as she'll ever be. Thank you, Miles. Katarina said, her own voice steady. Their exchange was brief, almost telepathic. He didn't wish her luck. Luck was for gamblers. He didn't tell her to be careful. That would have been an insult to her skill. He simply handed her the helmet bag, a transfer of trust and responsibility. He cared for the machine. She would pilot it. It was a sacred pact. She began her walk around, a ritual she performed with the focused reverence of a priestess. It was a slow, deliberate dance of touch and sight. Her gloved fingers traced the thick, straight leading edge of the wing designed for low-speed lift and resilience. She ran her hand over the massive, unyielding main landing gear built to absorb the punishment of landing on cratered, unimproved airstrips. This was not a delicate instrument. It was a tool forged for the harshest of realities. She paused at the nose, standing before the immense, intimidating muzzle of the GAU-8 Avenger. The 30mm cannon was the heart of the aircraft. The A-10 had in fact been designed and built around it. 7 barrels of depleted uranium-tipped fury. It was a weapon of devastating power, but Katarina saw it as an instrument of salvation. It was the voice that spoke to the enemies of the soldiers on the ground, a definitive, unarguable statement. As she looked at the cannon, A memory surfaced, sharp and clear. Her first instructor at flight school, a grizzled F-16 pilot filling a temporary post, had looked at her with skepticism. "The Warthog isn't a ladies' plane Rostova," he'd said. "It doesn't dance. It doesn't sing. You can't finesse it. You have to wrestle it, make it obey." He had been wrong. You didn't wrestle the Warthog. You listened to it. You felt the subtle vibrations through the stick, the change in the engine's tone, the way the air flowed over its wings. You didn't make it obey. You formed a partnership with it. Her inspection complete. She met Miles's gaze and gave a single sharp nod. He nodded back, stepping forward to steady the ladder against the wind. Katarina ascended each step familiar and lowered herself into the cockpit. The world outside vanished. The cockpit was her sanctuary, a space she knew more intimately than any room she had ever lived in. Her hands moved with an unconscious, muscle-memorized grace, flipping switches, testing buttons, running through the startup sequence. The smell was familiar, a mix of hydraulic fluid electronics and the faint, clean scent of her own oxygen mask. She settled into the seat, feeling the hard embrace of the titanium bathtub that surrounded her, a shell designed to withstand direct hits from anti-aircraft cannons. She pulled on her helmet, the world dimming for a moment, before the systems came to life. First, the low hum of the auxiliary power unit. Then the deeper, throatier whine as the twin General Electric turbofan engines began to spool. The instrument panels lit up, bathing the cockpit in a soft green and amber glow. The head-up display flickered into existence, a translucent pane of glass projecting critical flight data into her line of sight. The machine was waking up. She could feel its lifeblood flowing, the hydraulic pressure building, the avionics systems performing their silent high-speed calculus. She was no longer just Katarina Rostova. She was the human component of a complex weapon system, the brain to its powerful armored body. With a final flick of a switch, she lowered the heavy plexiglass canopy. The hydraulic lock engaged with a solid, reassuring thud. The deafening roar of the storm was instantly muted, reduced to a distant, frustrated howl. Inside this bubble of technology and purpose, there was a sudden, profound quiet. All the noise of the base, the doubts of her colleagues, the fury of the weather, it was all outside. Here there was only the steady hum of the electronics, the soft hiss of the oxygen system, and the rhythmic beat of her own heart. She looked out at the blurred, chaotic world beyond the glass. She was alone, sealed in the heart of her machine on the precipice of an impossible flight. She keyed her internal comms, a habit she had when flying solo. Her voice, a low murmur, meant only for the two of them. "Okay, old girl," she whispered. "Let's go for a ride." The taxi from the shelter to the runway was a disorienting crawl through a world of white noise. Through the armored glass of her canopy, Katarina could barely make out the faint blue runway lights blurred into hazy apparitions by the sheeting snow. The Warthog felt like a prehistoric beast wading through a blizzard, its movements slow and ponderous. The crosswind, even on the ground, was a relentless shoving force trying to push the 23-ton aircraft off the tarmac. She had to fight the rudder pedals constantly, her inputs firm and precise to keep the nose pointed straight. She reached the threshold of runway 29er. The control tower's voice was a tinny, distant presence in her helmet, a formality in the face of the tempest. "Valkyrie 1, you are cleared for takeoff. Wind is 240 at 60 knots, gusting to 80. Godspeed, Captain. Godspeed." The word felt archaic, a prayer offered up to the storm. Katarina didn't believe in God, not in the traditional sense. Her faith was placed in thrust-to-weight ratios, in hydraulic pressures, and in the unwavering sturdiness of the machine beneath her. She pushed the twin throttles forward to their stops. The GE engines spooled from a whine to a deafening roar, a sound of pure, contained power that vibrated through the very marrow of her bones. The A-10 surged forward, accelerating into the teeth of the gale. The world outside became a meaningless smear of gray and white. Her entire focus narrowed to the glowing symbology of the head-up display. Airspeed alive. Rudder, rudder, more rudder to counteract the wind. The nose wanted to yaw to turn away from the fight, but she held it steady. 140 knots. The moment of commitment. With a firm, steady pull on the control stick, she rotated. The Warthog, heavy with fuel, seemed to claw its way into the air, protesting the violation of gravity. The moment the wheels left the runway, the storm seized the aircraft. It was not turbulence. It was a physical beating. The plane was slammed downwards, then thrown upwards with a violence that sent her helmet crashing against the canopy. A chorus of alarms shrieked in the cockpit stall warnings. Altitude alerts, the placid female voice of the onboard computer repeating, "Warning! Warning!" with unnerving calm. This was the veil, the barrier that had kept all other aircraft grounded. She wasn't flying through it. She was punching a hole in it with sheer thrust and will. Her arms ached, her muscles burning as she fought the controls, making thousands of micro-corrections a minute. Her eyes scanned her instruments in a ceaseless, practiced loop attitude indicator, airspeed, vertical velocity, engine temperature. To look outside would be to invite vertigo to surrender to the chaos. Her world was the cockpit. Her reality was the data. Her plan had been simple in its audacity climb, just high enough to clear coastal obstacles, then dive getting underneath the worst of the low-altitude wind shear and into the compressed, marginally more stable air just above the waves. It was a maneuver that existed in the slim theoretical margins between extremely dangerous and certainly fatal. At 3,000 feet, she nosed the Warthog over. The descent was a controlled fall. The vertical velocity indicator spun, and the radar altimeter began to count down with terrifying speed. 2,000 feet. 1,000 feet. The turbulence was a sustained, bone-jarring vibration, now the drumming of ice and sleet against the canopy, a constant, maddening rhythm. 500 feet. She began to pull back on the stick, leveling out. The G-forces pressed her down into her seat. The plane shuddered, its wings flexing under the immense strain. 100 feet. The world outside remained an impenetrable curtain of gray. She had breached the first layer of the storm, but now she was flying blind in the most dangerous airspace on the planet. Her life was now measured by the green, sweeping line of the terrain-following radar and the digital numerals of the altimeter. She was a navigator in a gray hell, her only map an electronic one. The sound in her helmet was a trinity of noises. The steady hiss of her own breathing through the oxygen mask, the roar of the engines behind her, and the calm, synthetic voice of the computer. Altitude. It would state whenever a pocket of downdraft sucked the heavy plane towards the unseen waves below. Time lost its meaning. Seconds stretched into minutes, minutes into an eternity. Her body was locked in a state of supreme tension, yet her mind was a pool of cold focus. This was where the pilot and machine truly merged. She could feel the aircraft struggle as if it were her own, the strain on the airframe, the engines fighting for clean air. She wasn't just giving it commands. She was anticipating its needs, working with it, a symbiosis of flesh and metal against the rage of nature. A sudden sharp icon bloomed on the radar display. A massive spike rising from the sea. A rogue wave, a 30-meter wall of water materializing out of the chaos directly in her path. Instinct took over. She yanked the stick back the engines, screaming as she demanded every ounce of power they possessed. The A-10 leaped upwards, clearing the invisible crest. by what felt like inches. For a terrifying second, she felt the spray from the wave lash against the belly of her aircraft. Then it was gone. She pushed the nose back down her heart, hammering against her ribs, resuming her perilous flight at 100 feet. Her course was a jagged line, a frantic dance dictated by the radar. A new threat appeared. The radar showed a solid mass ahead, the sheer cliffs of a smaller, uncharted island. Terrain, terrain, pull up! The computer warned, its voice now urgent. There was no room to climb. Her only option was to bank. She threw the stick to the right, pushing the A-10 into a steep 60-degree turn that sent the blood rushing to her head. The G-force was immense, a crushing weight on her chest. She could hear the airframe groaning in protest, a sound that would terrify a lesser pilot. But Katarina knew what the Warthog could endure. She trusted its over-engineered spars, its rugged, honest construction. She held the turn until the radar showed clear air ahead, then leveled out her breath, coming in ragged gasps. She had flown past a wall of rock. She had never seen a granite tomb that had nearly claimed her. She flew on a solitary soul in a universe of wind and water. The mission, the men on the island, became a single burning point of light in her mind, an anchor against the disorienting madness of the flight. It was the only thing that was real. Then, after an age of gray nothingness, a new symbol blinked to life on her navigation display. A small triangular icon, the proximity beacon for Bear Island. She had made it. She had flown through the wall. She was here. A wave of relief so powerful it almost made her dizzy washed over her. But she suppressed it instantly. The flight was not the mission. It was merely the commute. Now the real work began. Through the storm and the darkness, she had to find a half-mile stretch of frozen beach on an island of rock and land on it. For the men of Ari's team, the world had shrunk to a 10-meter perimeter of frozen rock. The cold was no longer an external force. It was a thief that had crept inside their bones. It stole the dexterity from their fingers and leached the warmth from their blood. Every breath was a painful intake of ice crystals, every exhale a plume of steam instantly torn away by the wind. They were a small island of fading warmth in an ocean of absolute cold. Lieutenant Commander Marcus Thorne lay pressed against a slab of granite, the stock of his rifle cold enough to burn through his gloves. He watched the whiteout, his eyes straining to perceive shapes in the chaos. The enemy was still out there, a pack of patient wolves circling their prey. They had spent the last hour making probing attacks, quick and vicious feints designed to make the SEALs waste ammunition. Thorne knew the tactic well. He had used it himself many times. Ammunition was now the currency of their survival, and they were nearly bankrupt. Jester and Reaper were down to their last 2 magazines each. Thorne had 3. Only Hex, the sniper who had been firing single, precisely aimed shots, had a reasonable supply left. Their situation had moved from critical to terminal. "How's he doing?" Thorne asked, his voice low, directed at Pops, who was crouched over Rico. The medic didn't look up. "He's going into shock. I've done all I can, but he's losing too much heat. If we don't get him out of this wind, he's not going to last another hour." The words were flat, professional, and utterly damning. Thorne felt the weight of them settle on his shoulders, another layer of responsibility on top of an already unbearable load. He looked at his men. Their faces were etched with cold and fatigue, but their eyes were still clear, still locked on him, still full of trust. It was a trust he felt he was about to fail. He had led them here, and he would die with them here. A commander's final bitter duty. The attack, when it came, was not a feint. It was a full-throated assault. 3 figures clad in white winter camouflage burst from the swirling snow, firing as they charged. Muzzle flashes lit the gray gloom, the sharp, high-velocity crack of their AK-12s, distinct from the deeper bark of the SEAL's M4s. "Contact front," Jester yelled, his voice nearly swallowed by the gale. Ari's team responded with the brutal efficiency of a single organism. Fire was returned, not in panicked sprays, but in controlled two-round bursts. An attacker fell. The other two dove for cover behind a snowdrift, returning fire. More shapes were moving on the flanks, using the storm's noise to mask their approach. The wolves were closing in for the kill. A round ricocheted off the rock inches from Thorn's head, spraying his face with chips of stone. They were being overwhelmed. Their perimeter was shrinking, their fire becoming less effective. The end was coming fast and violent. It was in this moment of desperation, as Thorn was preparing to give the order for a final hopeless countercharge, that the new sound arrived. It was not of the storm. It was deeper than the wind, lower than the crash of the waves. It was a guttural, grinding roar, a sound that seemed to emanate from the very bedrock of the island. It vibrated in their chests, a menacing thrum that rose in pitch and volume until it dominated everything. Every man, attacker and defender alike, froze. "What in God's name is that?" Reaper breathed, his eyes wide, scanning the impenetrable sky. Thorn knew that sound. He had heard it over the mountains of Afghanistan and the deserts of Iraq. It was the sound of salvation for the soldier on the ground. The unmistakable, fearsome growl of two TF-34 turbofan engines working at high power. It was the sound of a Warthog. He couldn't believe it. No pilot should be able to fly in this. No aircraft should be able to withstand it. Yet the sound was real, undeniable. It was close. Dangerously close. A shadow, a darker gray against the lighter gray, flashed overhead for a fraction of a second, so fast. It might have been an illusion, a hallucination brought on by cold and stress. But the sound remained, circling them like an unseen guardian angel forged from titanium and hatred. The effect on the enemy was immediate and profound. Their disciplined assault dissolved into confusion. They were soldiers trained for conventional combat, for fighting men they could see. They were not prepared for a mythological beast to descend from the heart of a hurricane. Their fire slackened, their attention now turned to the sky, searching for the source of that terrifying noise. The hunter had become the prey. For Thorn, the moment was a cataclysm of conflicting emotions. Awe, raw and potent at the sheer, magnificent insanity of the pilot. White-hot anger at the command that had sanctioned this suicidal flight. But beneath it all, an emotion he had forcibly purged from his mind hours ago came rushing back with the force of a tidal wave: hope. It was a bitter, painful, beautiful thing. It spread through the team like wildfire. He saw it in their eyes, in the way they straightened their shoulders, in the grim set of their jaws. They were no longer dying men. They were soldiers with air support. He scrambled for his radio, fumbling with the handset, his numb fingers clumsy. He had to make contact. He had to guide this mad Valkyrie, to give her a target, to let her know they were still alive. He keyed the mic, his voice hoarse, raw with cold and emotion. "Meter Valkyrie 1, this is Ares. We hear you," he shouted, desperate for his words to cut through the storm. "I don't know who you are, but you've got guts. Talk to me." He released the button, the silence on the line, stretching for an eternity. There was only the roar of her engines and the howl of the wind. Then a voice, calm and clear, cut through the static. It was female, devoid of panic, laced with an impossible professionalism. "Solid copy, Ares. Valkyrie is on station. Glad to hear your voice. What do you have for me?" "Solid copy, Ares. Valkyrie is on station. Glad to hear your voice. What do you have for me?" Katarina's voice, filtered through the radio, was an anchor of impossible calm in the storm of violence on the ground. For Thorn, hearing it was like a drowning man finding a pocket of air. His mind, which had been preparing for the brutal calculus of a last stand, instantly re-engaged, switching from survival to tactical mode. Valkyrie, we have multiple hostiles in the rocks bearing 045 from our position range approximately 150 meters. He reported, his words clipped and precise. We are marked by an IR strobe, but I doubt you can see it. A negative on the strobe, Ares. This storm is a solid wall. Katarina's voice came back, confirming the grim reality. I'm flying blind up here. I'm going to have to trust your eyes. Talk me in. Thorn understood immediately. This was the highest stakes version of a ground-controlled approach, not for a landing, but for a kill. He was now her targeting pod. The lives of his men and her own rested on the clarity of his directions. Roger that, Valkyrie. Come about to a heading of 190. I will call your turn to final. From Katarina's cockpit, the world remained a swirling vortex of gray. She could not see the island, the rocks, or the men below. Her existence was a delicate balance between the raw data on her screens and the disembodied voice in her ears. She banked the Warthog, the turn heavy and sluggish, in the dense, turbulent air, her eyes locked on the compass and the HUD. You are outbound, Thorn's voice directed. Steady on that heading. The wind is pushing you west. Katarina made the correction, crabbing the aircraft into the wind, a constant, grueling exercise. She descended further, dropping to a perilous 75 feet. The radar altimeter chirped a constant, nervous warning. Okay, Valkyrie, begin a standard rate turn to your left, heading 090. You'll be flying parallel to our position. She eased the stick, left the plane, responding with a groaning reluctance. She was now flying directly into the teeth of the crosswind, the aircraft shuddering as if it might tear itself apart. Her entire being was focused on keeping the wings level, on holding the altitude steady. 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 Thorn's voice was a lifeline in the chaos. You are approaching the target area. 5 seconds. Katarina's thumb moved to the weapons control stick, resting on the top hat switch that would arm the GAU-8. She flipped up the master arm switch. The familiar green armed light illuminated the cockpit. 3, 2, fire now. Her thumb depressed the trigger. The world erupted. The A-10 unleashed a sound that eclipsed the storm itself, a deep, apocalyptic brrrr that was more of a physical force than a noise. The entire airframe vibrated violently as the cannon spat out 30mm rounds at a rate of 65 per second. For 2 seconds, she held the trigger down, a stream of depleted uranium death pouring into a precise coordinate in a world she could not see. On the ground, the effect was biblical. A line of explosions like a giant's chainsaw ripped across the rocks where the enemy had been positioned. Snow ice and black stone were thrown hundreds of feet into the air. The assault ceased, instantly replaced by panicked, fleeting shapes retreating into the storm. Now, good effect on target, Valkyrie, good effect. Thorn yelled into the radio, a raw, primal triumph in his voice. Target neutralized. You just saved our asses. Glad to be of service, Ares. Katarina replied, her breathing steady, though her heart was pounding. What's your team's status? Any casualties? Thorn's elation evaporated, replaced by the grim reality of their situation. We have 1 man wounded and critical. He's going into hypothermic shock. We need to get him out of the wind. Valkyrie, your plan was to land. The question hung in the air, the sheer audacity of it seeming even more insane now that the immediate threat was gone. So that's the plan, Ares. I need to find that beach. I'm commencing a search pattern. Keep your radio open. She began a slow, wide circle around the island's last known coordinates. The flight was a nightmare of navigation, her eyes darting between the GPS, the radar map, and the terrifyingly blank view through her canopy. It was one thing to identify a potential landing strip on a clear satellite image from the comfort of a briefing room. It was another entirely to find it in a blizzard while flying a 23-ton attack jet 50 feet above a fatal coastline. "I'm passing over the northern tip now," she reported. "We see you," Thorne replied. "A shadow just for a second. The beach is on your 3 o'clock, about half a mile." Katarina banked her stomach, tightening into a cold knot. This was it. She lowered the landing gear. The 3 heavy struts slammed into place with a reassuring thud, but they also acted like sails catching the wind and making the plane even more unstable. She lowered the flaps, increasing lift, but also drag. The aircraft slowed, becoming sluggish, threatening to stall. Through a momentary, miraculous gap in the snow, she saw it. Not a beach, but a sliver of dark gray between the white of the land and the black of the sea. It was impossibly short, terrifyingly narrow. From the rocks, the seals watched in horrified awe. The A-10's landing lights cut a ghostly cone through the blizzard, illuminating a maelstrom of snow. The plane wasn't approaching straight. It was flying almost sideways, its nose pointed 30 degrees into the wind to counteract the drift. "You're too high, Valkyrie! You're too high!" Thorne said into the mic, unable to stop himself. "I know," she replied, her voice strained with effort. She wasn't too high. She was using a dangerous technique, a forward slip bleeding off altitude without gaining airspeed. At the last possible second, she kicked the rudder hard, straightening the nose just as the wheels were about to touch down. The impact was brutal. The right wheel hit the frozen sand first, the landing strut absorbing the force with a groan that she felt through the entire airframe. The plane bounced, threatening to become airborne again, but she forced it down, slamming the left wheel onto the ground. The Warthog was down, but it was not safe. It immediately began to weather vane the wind on its huge tail, trying to spin it around into the sea. She fought the rudder pedals, her leg muscles screaming in protest. She applied the brakes, but the wheels skidded uselessly on the ice-slicked surface. The black churning water loomed in her windscreen, rushing towards her. There was no room. She was not going to stop. In a final desperate act of will and skill, she jammed the right rudder pedal to the floor and applied a burst of power to the left engine. The A-10 pivoted violently, skidding in a great arc, its left wingtip just skimming above the frozen ground. It spun 180 degrees and finally slid to a halt, its tail now facing the sea, its nose pointed back the way it had come. The engines whined down. The only sound in the cockpit was her own ragged, gasping breath. She looked out the canopy. The nose of her aircraft was less than 10 meters from the water's edge. She had done it. For a long moment, she just sat there, her hands shaking, her body drenched in sweat. Then, with methodical purpose, she ran through the shutdown sequence. The hum of the avionics died. The green glow of the HUD faded to black. The sanctuary fell silent. With a hiss of hydraulics, she opened the canopy. The storm rushed in a blast of Arctic cold and screaming wind, a violent return to reality. Slowly, she unstrapped herself and stood up in the cockpit. A small, solitary figure silhouetted against the fury of the storm she had just conquered. For a long moment, after the A-10's engines whined into silence, no one on the rocks moved. The 6 members of Ares' team men who had operated in the world's most violent and surreal landscapes simply stared. The aircraft on the beach was an impossible object, a hallucination of steel and rivets rendered solid against the storm. It sat there massive and menacing, its cannon pointed out at the turbulent sea, a conqueror surveying its new brutal domain. And in its heart, a lone figure was standing. Marcus Thorne was the first to break the spell. The discipline of command, ingrained deeper than instinct, took over. "Pop's Jester, get Rico on the litter. We're moving." He ordered, his voice sounding rusty and foreign in his own ears. "The rest of you with me." The movement was slow, almost reluctant, as if they were afraid the vision might dissolve if they approached too quickly. They clambered down from the rocks onto the open expanse of the beach, and the full, unmitigated force of the storm hit them. The wind was a physical beast, stealing their breath and trying to tear them from their feet. Each step was a battle. From her perch in the cockpit, Katarina watched them approach. They were specters, emerging from the whiteout, large men burdened with weapons and gear, moving with a weary but relentless purpose. The adrenaline that had sustained her through the flight and landing was beginning to recede, leaving behind a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. A tremor ran through her hands, and she clenched them into fists, willing them to be still. She had more to do. The mission wasn't over until the men were safe. With practiced efficiency, she completed the final items on her shutdown checklist, securing her aircraft against the elements. She activated the switch to deploy the integral cockpit ladder. It folded down from the side of the fuselage with a quiet mechanical whir, its steps seeming impossibly small against the bulk of the plane. She swung her legs over the side, her movements measured and economic. She did not rush. She descended the ladder, her boots finding each rung with certainty, her eyes fixed on the approaching figures. When her feet touched the frozen ground, the sense of scale was jarring. Standing next to the Warthog's enormous main landing gear, whose wheel was taller than her waist, she felt small. A single, slender human against the combined might of the storm and the machine. Thorn's team stopped about 10 feet away from her, forming a loose, protective semicircle. Thorn himself took 2 more steps forward and stopped. He reached up and pulled off his combat helmet and snow goggles, revealing a face chiseled by hardship. His skin was red and raw from windburn, and ice clung to his eyebrows and the stubble on his jaw. His eyes, a startlingly clear gray, were weary, but held an intensity that seemed to burn through the blizzard. Following his lead, Katarina reached up, unlatched her own helmet, and pulled it off. Her dark hair, damp with sweat, was plastered to her head. She shook it loose, the wind immediately catching the strands and whipping them across her face. And then there was silence. It was a profound stillness in the heart of the roaring gale. No words were spoken. Thorn had expected. He didn't know what he had expected. A swaggering hotshot, a terrified rookie something. He had not expected this quiet woman whose slight frame seemed to house an unshakable core of solid iron. He looked into her eyes, dark and exhausted, but utterly placid. There was no arrogance in them, no fear, no plea for validation. There was only the calm, appraising gaze of a fellow professional who had done her job. He saw the pilot who had wrestled a 20-ton attack jet through a polar vortex, who had trusted his voice to guide her cannon, who had put her machine down on a sliver of ice to save him and his men. The labels he might have unconsciously applied, woman captain pilot, all dissolved into one singular, undeniable truth warrior. Katarina looked back at him, and she saw the entirety of his ordeal etched onto his face. But in his eyes, she saw something she had sought her entire career, something she had rarely, if ever, been granted so freely. It wasn't just gratitude. Gratitude was an emotion, fleeting and subjective. This was something more fundamental. It was respect, pure, absolute, and unconditional. It was the silent, unambiguous acknowledgement from one professional at the pinnacle of his craft to another. In that shared gaze, every barrier of rank, service branch, and gender evaporated. They were 2 sides of the same coin, the shield in the sky, the spear on the ground. The moment stretched timeless. It was Thorn who finally broke the silence, his voice rough against the wind. Captain Rostova. It was a statement, not a question. Lieutenant Commander Thorn. She replied, her voice steady, acknowledging the return to the world of names and ranks. The spell was broken. Pops and Jester were approaching now, carrying Rico, who was pale and shivering uncontrollably on the litter. The urgency of their situation rushed back in. Why do we have to get him out of this wind? Thorn set his focus, shifting instantly to his wounded man. Now. Katarina's eyes swept over her aircraft. It was more than a weapon. It was a resource. The engines are off, but the APU is still running for heat and power, she said, her voice taking on a tone of command. We can't stay in the cockpit. The main landing gear bay. It's enclosed, shielded. There's enough room. She turned and led the way, not waiting for an answer. She moved towards a small access panel near the root of the wing, her steps sure against the gale. The SEALs, these titans of the battlefield, exchanged a single brief look and followed the woman who had fallen from the sky, moving to place their wounded brother into the protective belly of the beast that had saved them all. The main landing gear bay of an A-10 Thunderbolt II was never designed for human occupancy. It was a cramped angular space, a tight maze of thick hydraulic lines, bundled wires, and the massive greasy machinery of the retraction system. The air was thick with the metallic tang of hydraulic fluid and the clean, cold scent of ozone from the nearby avionics. Yet to the men of Ares' team, it was a cathedral. The moment Katarina secured the access hatch, the world changed. The storm's deafening, soul-stealing roar was reduced to a dull, distant rumble, the physical assault of the wind completely gone. The relief was instantaneous and profound. Muscles they hadn't even realized were tensed against the gale began to unclench. For the first time in hours, they were not actively fighting the elements for survival. "Get him here!" Pops ordered, his voice echoing in the confined space. "Get that light on him." Katarina had already used a service cable to rig a low-wattage maintenance lamp, and its steady clinical glow pushed back the shadows. The SEALs gently lowered Rico into the center of the bay. Here, shielded from the wind, Pops could finally work. He cut away the frozen fabric of Rico's trousers with practiced efficiency, exposing the crude, blood-soaked pressure dressing he'd applied earlier. His hands, though still cold, moved with a surgeon's precision as he cleaned the wound, applied a hemostatic agent, and wrapped it in a fresh, sterile bandage. The other SEALs huddled together, their powerful frames seeming oversized in the cramped compartment. They were silent, their exhaustion a palpable presence. They watched their brother, their leader, and the pilot trusting in the quiet competence that now filled their small sanctuary. Katarina did not rest. While the medic tended to the man, she tended to the machine. With a diagnostic tablet plugged into a port inside the bay, she began running a systems check. Her face, illuminated by the tablet's cool blue light, was a mask of concentration as she scanned lines of code checking for faults and stress warnings. To the SEALs, she was a pilot. But in this moment, she was also the aircraft's doctor, assessing its injuries after their shared ordeal. She finished with the tablet and began a physical inspection. She ran her bare hands over the massive main strut of the landing gear, feeling for hairline fractures or warped metal. She checked the hydraulic lines for leaks, her touch light and knowing. It was an intimate act, a communion between human and machine. She knew this aircraft not just from a manual, but through 1,000 hours of flight, through the vibrations felt in her spine, the sounds that told her everything was right or wrong. Thorn watched her fascinated. She moved with a quiet, proprietary grace, as if this cold, complex machinery were a living extension of herself. She was its keeper. Finally, her inspection done, she leaned against a bulkhead, the tablet in her hand, her gaze distant for a moment. Thorn moved from his position near Rico and approached her, his movements careful in the tight space. "Tvet repuchot," he asked, his voice low. Katarina looked up, her focus returning to him. "Superficial. The landing was aggressive, but the gear is sound. Some minor dings on the fuselage from ice, but nothing critical. She's tough." There was a hint of pride in her voice when she spoke of the plane, the affection a rider has for a trusted steed. "No one else would have tried that flight," Thorn stated. It wasn't a question or a compliment, but a simple declaration of fact. The data supported the attempt. She replied, deflecting the praise with technical truth. The aircraft's performance envelope, the low-pressure cell structure, the tidal patterns. It was a viable, if high-risk, solution. Thorn almost smiled. He was a man who lived by data, by risk assessment, by stripping emotion from the equation to find the optimal path. He was hearing his own logic spoken back to him, but used to justify an act of what seemed like pure, transcendent courage. "The data doesn't fly the plane, Captain," he said quietly. Her gaze met his. For the first time, a flicker of something beyond professional calm appeared in her eyes, a hint of the immense strain she had been under. "No," she said softly. "It doesn't." They stood in silence for a moment, the only sounds the muffled howl of the wind outside and the steady hum of the aircraft's auxiliary power unit. The storm raged, a chaotic, mindless force of nature. But here in the belly of the Warthog, a fragile, determined stillness had taken hold. It was the quiet of a shared purpose, of mutual respect, earned in the crucible of a crisis. He's stabilizing," Pops announced from across the bay, his voice filled with weary relief. "Pulse is stronger. Core temperature is coming back up. You got him out of the wind just in time, Captain. A few more minutes out there." He didn't need to finish the sentence. Katarina gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, her eyes closing for a fraction of a second. It was the only sign of the immense burden of responsibility she had been carrying. Thorn looked from his wounded teammate, now breathing more easily, to the pilot, who had flown through an impossible storm to make this moment of peace possible. She had faced the storm without, and in doing so had created a stillness within which life could be saved. The war for the island was not over, and their extraction was still an uncertainty, but they had won this battle. Together. Time inside the gear bay passed in a strange, disjointed rhythm. They existed in a state of suspended animation, a small bubble of life insulated from the war outside. Men dozed in shifts, a deep, exhausted sleep from which they would twitch awake, their hands reaching for weapons at the slightest change in the aircraft's groaning. Katarina and Thorn did not sleep. They maintained a quiet, shared vigil, monitoring the aircraft's systems and listening to the voice of the storm. The change, when it came, was not sudden. It was a gradual easing of pressure, a slow unwinding of a tightly coiled spring. The violent, percussive blasts of wind against the fuselage softened into a sustained, deep-throated roar. The high-pitched shriek of turbulence through the control surfaces faded, replaced by the steady moan of the gale. After what felt like an eternity of chaos, a semblance of rhythm returned to the world. Katarina was the first to notice the subtle shift in the quality of the darkness. The absolute blackness, visible through a small viewport in the hatch, was beginning to yield to a deep, bruised purple. "It's breaking," she said, her voice quiet in the humming stillness of the bay. Thorn was on his feet instantly. He moved to the main hatch, his hand resting on the release lever. "Everyone be ready," he commanded, his voice low but sharp, cutting through the weary silence. The SEALs were instantly alert, weapons raised, their brief respite over. Thorn cracked the seal. The hatch opened a few inches, and a blast of cold, clean air rushed in, purging the cramped space of the scent of oil and sweat. He peered out, then pushed the hatch fully open and stepped outside. The world had been remade. The beach was a pristine, sculpted landscape of white and blue. The wind, though still brutally cold, had lost its hurricane-force violence. It was now a powerful, steady gale, but one that a person could stand against. Above, the thick, oppressive ceiling of cloud had fractured, revealing a sky of deep indigo and violet. On the eastern horizon, a razor-thin line of pale, silvery light announced the coming dawn. The sea, no longer a churning black nightmare, had settled into a heavy, deep gray swell capped with white foam. The island was draped in a blanket of fresh snow, a mantle of profound and deceptive peace. The only scar on the landscape was the dark, churned-up patch of rock and earth, where Katarina's cannon fire had struck a stark reminder of the violence that had transpired. One by one, the SEALs emerged from the gear bay, blinking in the new light. They moved with fluid professionalism, immediately establishing a defensive perimeter, their eyes scanning the pristine ridges for any sign of movement. The beauty of the scene was lost on them. It was a tactical problem, a landscape of potential threats and firing angles. Katarina, meanwhile, began her own assessment. Her focus was on the improvised runway. She walked the length of the beach, her boots crunching in the frozen sand, her eyes examining the surface. It was slick with a thin layer of ice from the storm surge, but the underlying frozen sand and gravel base seemed solid. It was dangerously short, and the crosswind was still a significant factor, but it was possible. A rescue helicopter has been dispatched from the USS Arlington, Thorne said, coming to stand beside her. They've been on standby waiting for a weather window. You opened it for them. ETA is 30 minutes. Katarina nodded. I'm not staying on the ground to greet them. The enemy might still be out there. They could have man-pads. I'll be more useful in the air providing cover. Thorne looked from her to the aircraft, then back to the short, icy runway. You landed it. Taking off is going to be another story. She's a Warthog commander. Katarina said, a faint, confident smile touching her lips for the first time. She was born for ugly airfields. What happened next was a study in quiet, seamless cooperation. There was no longer a pilot and a SEAL team. There was a single unit with a shared objective. Under Katarina's clear, concise direction, the SEALs helped her prepare the aircraft for flight. Jester and Reaper, using their entrenching tools, scraped the worst of the ice from the leading edges of the wings. Pops and Hex helped her perform a visual inspection of the ordnance, ensuring the remaining missiles and bombs hadn't been damaged in the landing. It was a strange sight, these elite maritime commandos acting as the ground crew for an Air Force pilot, their movements synchronized in the cold morning light. Finally, all was ready. The SEALs took up their positions again, forming a protective circle as Katarina climbed back into her cockpit. The pre-flight ritual was quicker this time, a focused, abbreviated version of the one she had performed back at Bodu. She pushed the ignition, and the engines began to spool up their familiar whine, a welcome sound, in the vast silence of the dawn. The canopy lowered once again, sealing her into her world of glass and green light. She taxied the A-10 to the far end of the beach, turning it to face the sea, using every precious foot of runway. Through the canopy, she gave Thorne a final sharp nod. He nodded back, then gave a thumbs up. She held the brakes, pushing the throttles to their maximum. The Warthog strained against its restraints, a beast eager to be unleashed, its engines screaming a protest into the dawn. Then she released the brakes. The plane leaped forward. The acceleration on the slick surface was terrifyingly slow. She could feel the rudder fighting the wind, the wheels threatening to lose their grip. The end of the beach and the cold, unforgiving Barents Sea rushed towards her. The airspeed indicator crept upwards with agonizing reluctance. 100 knots. 120. Not enough. She held it on the ground, building every last knot of speed she could, her instincts screaming at her to pull up. At the last possible second, with the water just yards away, she pulled back hard on the stick. For a heart-stopping moment, the plane seemed to hang in the air, its wheels just skimming the surface. Then, with a final shuddering effort, the Warthog's powerful wings caught the air, and it began to climb, clearing the waves by a margin so thin it was almost non-existent. She was airborne. On the beach, the SEALs watched, their breath held. They saw the aircraft claw its way into the sky, its landing gear retracting its silhouette a dark cross against the pale, emerging sun. Katarina banked, circling the island, once a gesture of silent acknowledgement. Then she climbed higher, assuming a high orbit, a guardian positioning herself to watch over the men she had saved. On the western horizon, she saw a new shape appear, the large, reassuring form of a CH-53 Sea Stallion helicopter, their ride home. Her mission was complete. The flight back to Bordeaux was a study in profound contrasts. The A-10, now light on fuel, felt nimble and responsive in Katarina's hands. The sky, scrubbed clean by the storm, was a brilliant crystalline blue, and the morning sun cast long, sharp shadows over the snow-dusted Norwegian peaks below. There was no turbulence, no shrieking alarms, no gray curtain of death outside her canopy. There was only the steady, reassuring roar of the engines and the vast, peaceful emptiness of the sky. The violent life-or-death struggle of the past 12 hours already felt strangely distant, like a fever dream. The adrenaline had long since burned away, leaving in its place an exhaustion so deep it felt as if it had settled into her very bones. She flew on autopilot, not the aircraft's, but her own, a state of practiced professional calm that masked the turmoil beneath. She wasn't thinking of herself as a hero. Heroes belonged in stories. She was a pilot who had been presented with a problem, and she had used her training, her knowledge, and her machine to solve it. It was that simple and that complex. As the Norwegian coastline resolved into familiar patterns, she switched the radio to the Bordeaux approach frequency. The air traffic controller's voice was the same calm, professional cadence as always, yet there was a subtle difference in the airwaves. A quiet. Other pilots, normally chatty and informal, were silent. Her call sign, Valkyrie 1, was met with a crisp, efficient clearance to land devoid of any extraneous commentary. It was a silence that spoke volumes. Her landing on runway 29er was flawless. The tires kissed the asphalt with a gentle puff of smoke, and she rolled down the center line with unnerving precision. It was the smoothest, most unremarkable landing she had performed all month. As she taxied off the main runway and headed towards the squadron's hardened shelters, she began to see them. Small groups of ground crew, off-duty pilots, and maintenance technicians standing by the taxiways. They weren't cheering or waving. They were just watching. They stood in the cold morning air, hands in their pockets or arms crossed, and simply watched her Warthog, this ugly, stubborn beast of a plane, as it rolled past. Their faces were solemn, their gaze filled with a quiet, penetrating awe. She guided the A-10 into the familiar concrete cavern of A-7 and brought it to a gentle stop exactly on her marks. The hangar doors began to close, shutting out the bright morning and the silent observers. As she began her shutdown sequence, the deep hum of the engines spooling down, she saw Master Sergeant Miles approaching the cockpit. His weathered face was as always an unreadable mask, but as he looked up at her, he gave a slow, deliberate nod. It was a small gesture, but from Miles it was a 21-gun salute. Just as she was completing the final checklist item, a dark blue transport van pulled up and stopped just outside the shelter's entrance. The side door slid open, and Lieutenant Commander Marcus Thorne stepped out, followed by the rest of Ari's team. They were in clean, dry uniforms. Their faces were washed, but the exhaustion and the ghost of the ordeal remained in the deep shadows under their eyes. Rico was not with them. He was already in the expert hands of the base's medical staff. Katarina watched them approach her mind, preparing for the inevitable debriefing, the reports, the sterile accounting of the mission. She popped the canopy seal, and the hydraulic hiss sounded unnaturally loud in the quiet hangar. She climbed down the ladder, her legs feeling heavy and unsteady. She expected Thorne to walk up, offer a firm handshake and a formal "thank you." That is not what happened. As her boots touched the oil-stained concrete floor, Thorne, who had stopped 10 feet away, took a half-step back to align with his men. His face was serious, his posture rigid. "Team," he called out, his voice a sharp, commanding bark that echoed off the concrete walls. "A-10 hut." The 4 other SEALs snapped to a perfect state of attention, their bodies ramrod straight, their eyes locked forward. The air in the hangar grew thick, heavy with unspoken meaning. Katarina stood before them, a solitary figure in her flight suit, suddenly understanding what was about to happen. Thorne's eyes met hers. They held no pity, no condescension, only a raw, unambiguous respect. He gave another command, his voice clear and resonant. "Present arms." In a single unified motion, as sharp and precise as a rifle volley, the 5 men raised their right hands to their brows. It was not the casual, day-to-day salute exchanged between officers. This was the formal, solemn gesture reserved for fallen heroes, for visiting dignitaries, for the flag itself. It was the ultimate sign of deference and respect one warrior can give to another. In that silent, powerful gesture, they were not saluting a captain. They were saluting their savior. They were acknowledging a courage and skill that had transcended rank, service, and gender. For a heartbeat, Katarina was stunned into stillness. Her entire career had been a quiet, relentless battle for this very thing to be seen, to be valued for her competence alone. She had fought against whispers, doubts, and the low, heavy ceiling of institutional prejudice. And here in a cold hangar in northern Norway, it was being given to her freely and completely by 5 of the most elite soldiers on the planet. She straightened her tired shoulders, brought her heels together, and raised her own hand in a salute that was just as sharp, just as precise. Her eyes never left Thorne's. In that sustained, silent gaze, everything was understood. The barriers had not just been broken, they had been vaporized. The salutes were held for a long, meaningful moment, then dropped in perfect unison. No words were needed. The silence in the hangar was more eloquent than any speech. The mission was over, but something new had just begun. In the quiet of the hangar, more than a mission was concluded. A silent truth was affirmed that respect is not given by regulation, but forged in the crucible of impossible odds. It is a language spoken not in words, but in a shared gaze across a frozen beach, in the steady voice on a radio, cutting through a storm, in the perfect synchronicity of a salute between warriors. This story is a testament to the fact that the greatest storms are not always made of wind and ice, but of doubt and prejudice. They are conquered not by brute force, but by the quiet, unrelenting power of a professional who refuses to be denied. These are the narratives that drive us, tales of resilience, of unseen heroes, and of the moments that redefine the boundaries of the possible. To journey with us into more stories like Katarina's, to explore the lives of those who stand firm when all others falter, we invite you to subscribe and become part of our ongoing chronicle. The sky is vast, and there are always more storms to fly through. Until the next story, keep looking.